Thank you very much. So, good evening to you. And once again, I want to thank you, Professor, for offering us this opportunity, as it is always a pleasure to talk about what you've been working on for the past few years of your life. Yes, my name is Nathalie Nielson. I am a very recent doctor-in-law, as I have defended my thesis last December on the topic of the renewal of abuse of dominance and monopolization in the wake of digital platforms. I myself am French and American, so I did the comparative approach between French law, European law, which are very similar, and American antitrust laws. And it is close to my heart, and I found it very interesting because American antitrust law is being described as the birth of modern antitrust laws. But nowadays, I think that there is more of an influence of European competition law on American side. To start the presentation, and actually most of my presentation is based on this, I'm gonna play a game of Guess Who with all of you, with a list of practices that have either been submitted to commitments, sanctions, or are now facing trial. A game that you will all ace, and that will allow me to present you some of these cases at the same time. So first, guess who formulated a generic wording of the terms and conditions of use of the digital advertising platforms, which were subject to high degree of volatility, being a means of imposing differences in treatment over time between their business partners, which was described as a non-objective, non-transparent, and discriminatory implementation of these rules. So every time you have six choices: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, or Booking. So if you have a little idea about it, it was Google. I'm sorry, you wanted to answer. Next time I'll let you. Yeah, but yeah, Google, it's a French case. The French Competition Authority sanctioned Google on these grounds in December 19, 2019. As you know, online search engine includes two types of response: those generated by the ranking algorithm and the advertisements. The latter are acquired on the Google Ads platform, subject to compliance with rules that specify the condition of use. The problem being that Google arbitrarily changed these rules whenever they wanted. For example, you had an advertiser called Give Media that had its account suspended because it violated the Google Ads rules, whereas another competitor of Give Media that was doing the exact same thing was offered a special treatment by Google because it was Google's partner. So in the end, the generic wording of the Google Ads rules, the high degree of volatility were a means of imposing differences in treatment over time. And the reasoning was supported by the Paris Court of Appeal in a decision that I posted on the PowerPoint April 7, 2022. Second one is easy. Guess who used anti-steering clauses prohibiting music services providers from using purchase buttons or direct links within the application to outside this ecosystem, from informing users of subscription offers outside the application and price differences, or to send an email to users following an activity on the application? So I think you all have the answer to this one. Yes. It is Apple, of course, the famous App Store case from last year, in what was described as a remarkable case by Professor David Bosco, that you all probably know. The European Commission took an interest in these clauses that have been sanctioned on the notable basis of Article 102, Paragraph A of the TFU concerning unfair trading conditions. And what is remarkable in that decision is that the Commission takes a particularly broad view of abuse of dominance, stating that it is not required, I quote, that the conditions imposed on trading partners be necessarily unfair to trading partners, as they can also be unfair to third parties, including consumers. And it's the restriction of the end user's freedom of choice by these anti-steering clauses that made them abusive and unfair. Whereas in the beginning, abuse of exploitation initially consisted of taking advantage of your position to impose unfair conditions on your commercial partners. And here it was even on the consumers. So a particularly broad decision. Who processed data collected on third-party websites without users' consent, such consent representing a mandatory precondition for using the platform as it was required in the general conditions. Basically, most of them can be the answer right now, but one was sanctioned for it. And it was Facebook in the Facebook Bundeskartellamt case from July 4th, 2023, and the European Court of Justice judgments. And I find it very interesting because back in 2017, when you had Facebook being sanctioned by the European Commission for giving away false information on the WhatsApp Facebook merger, it was said that potential privacy concerns arising from the increased concentration of data under Facebook control as a result of the transaction did not fall within the scope of competition law because it was considered as a matter of privacy law. So 2017, that was only 6 years before that decision. And in that judgment from 2023, we recognize at point 50, and it explicitly said that access to and processing of personal data has become a significant factor in competition between companies in the digital economy. So we actually understood that we were not quite right about that, and we made progress on that topic. That's an easy one. Who tied their operating system to their software and personal computers that were sold? Microsoft, of course. And that's a well-known example from the Microsoft saga from the early 20s. So I'm not going to spend more time on this one. You all have read about it very extensively already. Whose contracts with smartphone providers led to the tying of smartphones with one specific web browser and general search service provider? The answer kind of being in the question. It's our champion, Google. Google, which you have the Google Android case in Europe, and I think you can link it to the decision as well in the US, this landmark judgment on August 5th, 2024, because in that judgment, Judge Mehta admits that Google has acquired its dominance competitively to superior quality and that their partners continue to choose Google by default because its search engine offers the best chance of monetizing queries. And nevertheless, in line with the Renewal ruling, the judge insisted that the case is not about the initial acquisition of monopoly power, but about the efforts made to maintain that position by means other than competition on the merits. And even if the contracts in question did not initially have an anti-competitive effect, it's Google's status as a monopolist that made it exclusive. And I think in that judgment from 2024, you have here a very close rapprochement. The American and European law are becoming very close in their interpretation. Who is actually facing trial for inserting exclusivity clauses in their contract with business partners regarding the use of API, forbidding those business partners to enter in competition with the platform or to promote competitors? So that is Facebook. It's the ongoing case in the US by the FTC against Facebook. It's not the only practices that are targeted by the complaint, as the past acquisition of WhatsApp and Instagram are also described as being anti-competitive. But as these operations had previously been approved by the same competition authority, I must admit I have little faith as regards to that claim being welcome, but I'm very curious about how the trial is going to end. This one. Who demoted rival using ranking algorithm while giving away prominent placement to its own product in search results. This is the most famous case out of all. The first Google decision, the Google shopping case in 2017. And I'm not gonna spend much time on it because this one as well, there is so much literature on it. Guess who inserted price parity clause or most favored nation clause in the contracts with hoteliers, forcing them to offer the best price and conditions on its platform. So yeah, this time it's Booking. Another case that is quite well known now because you have different decisions in different countries. For us in France, it finished in commitments that were accepted in 2015. And after that, Booking.com suppressed these clauses from their contracts in France. And on most favored clauses, guess who is now facing trial, notably for inserting a fair pricing clause, it is called like that allows the platform to penalize from product delisting to banning of sellers who engage in pricing practices that could undermine consumer trust. That is the formulation of the clause. So this time it is Amazon. It's the ongoing case of the Federal Trade Commission against Amazon. And interestingly enough, in the first case in 2023, you had the state of Colombia filed a complaint against Amazon for these clauses. And in the judgment in 2023, the judge did not recognize the anti-competitive nature of these clauses, while it recognized that the fair pricing policy prevented sellers from setting a price on Amazon that was significantly higher than on other online marketplaces. It set out in the judgment that it did not constitute a floor price and that nothing formally prohibited sellers from lowering prices on other markets. But by doing so, it did not take into account, I think, the practical effect of this clause. And the complaint of the FTC is very thorough in the description of the clauses. And even if there is no formal prohibition on offering the low prices, the accumulation of the penalty if you do something actually creates that effect. And I think this case has quite a chance to go further. SQ proposed commitments to reply to anti-competitive concerns regarding the transparency, objectivity, and non-discriminatory nature of API's access criteria to a digital advertising platform linked to social media. So again, answer is kind of in the question. Social media is Facebook. So that's a French case. In 2022, the Autorité de la Concurrence, the French Competition Authority, accepted commitments from Facebook, Meta, in 2022, because it was concluded in a preliminary observation that the conditions of access to APIs were neither transparent nor objective, creating a lack of security and predictability for Meta business partners. And in addition, Meta implemented denigrating behaviors and treated differently their business partners. So you had a series of commitments that were accepted, notably the creation of a program for the business partners for advertising technology companies, which included 2 different levels of partnership or a new API free of charge recommendation functionality. And those commitments are binding until 2027. Guess who is facing trial for its past acquisition of DoubleClick, the exploitation of data, or the tying of 2 products which have enabled opaque rules in the market, dictating how digital advertising is sold, and the very conditions under which its rivals can compete. So once again, Google, our champion. It's the second case of the DOJ against Google with a complaint filed this time in 2023. aimed more at the digital advertising sector, but the services offered. Yet again, these acquisitions were previously authorized, so I'm not sure about the issue of this case, but we'll see in the next few years. Guess who proposed commitments that were accepted to reply to concerns about the use of non-public commercial data of sellers on its marketplace to adjust its own retail offers? Amazon. It's the Amazon Marketplace case with commitments being accepted in 2022 by European Commission. And you had two concerns, one about the use of data between buyers and sellers, as Amazon is present both as the platform, the intermediary, and as a seller. And he has an unfair advantage towards the other sellers by collecting this data. And the second concern was as well with the buy box, with a bias towards Amazon's partners and the attribution of the buy box to these partners. And those were at the heart of the commitments. And the Commission accepted a series of commitments, including the abstention from using non-public data and also fair conditions of attribution to the buy box. And finally, guess who refused unconditionally to provide to rivals the necessary information for the interoperability with its operating systems? And this time it was Microsoft on the second act of the Microsoft saga in Europe. You had the tying and the refusal to provide information, and which resulted in 4 decisions: the non-compliance with the injunction, the sanction of the non-compliance with the commitments. So yes, and you could also add to all these cases that I presented to you the ongoing case of the DOJ against Apple in the complaint filed in 2024 in March. The Department of Justice alleged monopolization of the smartphone markets, virtually calling into question the business model on which Apple has been built since the launch of the iPhone. According to the division, this market has been monopolized by a series of predatory practices, such as limiting access to APIs, blocking innovative applications, suppressing cloud streaming services, resulting in discriminatory treatment. You also have, regarding Apple, the commitments that were accepted on July 2024 regarding Apple Pay, because Apple restricted access to the NFC input on iOS to third-party mobile wallet developers, and now they have to provide access after those commitments were accepted. Or finally, we also have a case in France called Les Droits Voisins in the press sector, which we had 4 decisions in 4 years against Google, with interim measures being pronounced first, their non-compliance being sanctioned, commitments being accepted, and 1 year later, their non-compliance being sanctioned. The aim is to restore balance of power between publishers, agencies, and Google. It's not quite a success for now, but for once, we actually have a very practical and quick law and quick decisions. So, what common points can you find in most of these decisions? First of all, if you look at it, most of them are actually very recent. When I first started my thesis in 2020, there were actually not that many decisions, and there has been an acceleration these past few years that are undeniable. We understood that there was a problem, the tendency of concentration of digital markets because of the winner-takes-all effects, because of the network effects, collective data, multi-sided markets. And back in 2020, we actually already started to tackle this issue. We had a few texts. In France, we had, for example, transparency obligations towards a platform operator, but it was in consumer law. In European law, we had the P2B regulation, but in the end, the obligations that were imposed were limited because the sanctions were very weak. Also, in competition law at the time, the legal criteria was sometimes inadequate with the delineation of relevant market and multi-sided markets, the fact that certain products or services are free. But in 4 years, we tackled that since we now have the new definition of relevant markets in European law from 8 February 2024 that is very complete about that and has dedicated sections. And in the US, you also have new merger guidelines from 2023 that are very, very thorough. Globally, we have in the past 4 years seen a decision making and a legislative approach to the digital issues, culminating in the adoption of the Digital Markets Act in Europe, even though it is described as not being a competition law text, which is very funny to me because I was at a conference a few weeks back organized by our university, and we had a European Commission member that was there to talk about Google and antitrust. And he insisted multiple times that the DMA is not a competition law text. You can see from my tone and my face that I highly disagree with him, but that is for another time. But for me, the last common point and the most important, I think, is actually the fact that what is causing problems nowadays is the unfairness of these practices. A common point between all these abuses is that they end up in discriminatory treatment, and that's why we now have the abuse of exploitation making a comeback. We were focused on abuse of eviction in the last 40 years, but now we are seeing that abuse of exploitation is one of the most prominent abuse in those digital markets. But I'm going to come back to this later. So one of my findings at the end of my thesis is that the prohibition of abuse of dominance is undeniably effective, much more than monopolization, even though monopolization is now reawakening with all those complaints that were filed. So competition law, I think, can adapt itself to tackle issues, which is demonstrated by all the cases that have been presented to you. But the fact that we have an effective prohibition does not necessarily mean that it is efficient, as efficiency can be defined as the correlation between the legislator intent and the results that are obtained. And abuse of dominance and monopolization are here to protect the market in itself. Is it the case when there is such a reiteration of anti-competitive practices from a few actors? Google, we are all looking at you. One can doubt it. And hence, the sanction is not deterrent enough anymore. The fines, whose effect intended is to restore competition promptly once a judgment has been handed down, is no longer satisfied because first, injunctions are sometimes not complied with for months or even years. And we lost all the dissuasive aspect as the threat is insufficiently credible for the market players. Calculating financial penalties has become too predictable. And imposing remedies, as you all know, can be quite difficult as well, with sometimes little knowledge of how these markets work. The classic example that I can give and that you all must know as well is the Google shopping case. Commitments were actually initially offered to the European Commission and they refused it. And I asked during that conference to the member of the European Commission why they refused. And he told me that the European Commission was afraid and scared that Google would have a stranglehold on the auctions if they accepted the commitments. And I told him, but isn't it basically what happened with the remedy anyway? He was like, yeah, so that was a trap question. But because in the end, in the way they implemented the remedy, in the words of Bustoen and Van Vammel, Either Google wins the auction, which amounts to an internal transfer, and is paid by the sellers who's good at his advertising, or either the competitors win and display their results, paying Google for the privilege in the meantime. So actually, the remedy is not quite satisfactory. This is why we chose regulation with the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act in Europe. Right now, digital in itself is ongoing a very large string of regulation. The problem being that Digital Markets Act is inspired by competition law, even if they say that it isn't. The list of obligations, when you look at it, it's just a practical list of all these decisions. And the sanctions are copying the mechanism of regulation number 123. And furthermore, the multiplication of texts regulating digital markets sometimes create cumulative obligation between them, and it's quite hard to articulate. For example, you have digital advertising sector, you have obligations both in the DMA and in the DSA. And I use the Greek mythology analogy, which I quite like. Let me read it to you. So, in this labyrinth of digital regulation, Theseus, today's lawyer, will have a hard time finding his way as the Aryan thread unrolled by those legislative texts is strewn with 1,000 knots. All of this to say, I think maybe we should focus on making abuse of dominance and monopolization prohibition more efficient for the future, especially since regulation has a temporary nature. It is supposed to respond to a systemic problem, and once it has accomplished its mission, to be replaced. So I therefore formulated a few propositions in my thesis to pursue this objective, which I will now try to quickly present with words of conclusion. So on the ongoing renewal of the prohibition, when I first started in September 2020, I focused on the possibility of a renewal approached as a question. It has now become clear that in the span of 4 years, what began as a hypothesis has become a reality. US antitrust law, long criticized for its inertia on monopolization, is experiencing a revival, notably through those multiple civil lawsuits filed by the DOJ and the FTC, the appointment of members from the neo-Brandeisian school of thought, even though they are now being replaced, unfortunately. European and domestic competition law has kept pace, undergoing a restructuring of the abuse concepts with renewed and welcome interest in exploitative abuse. We have the update of a new market definition notice, the guidelines on Article 102, and an evaluation of regulation number 123 on the sanction. But the annulment of the Google AdSense decision in September 2024 highlighted as well the fragility of those decisions on competition law. So there needs to be a modernization of the concept of abuse around the equalness of opportunities. By creating those digital ecosystems around a core historical activity, a small number of digital platforms have become essential business partners, not only for the companies, but also for the consumers. And they have used this position to impose unfair or discriminatory conditions. And the thesis is focused on these. And it is the inherent imbalance in this relationship that raises concern. And I think it's not a new phenomenon in itself. When you look at it, it's kind of cyclical. We had the Titans at the end of the 19th century. We had the dynamics between retail purchasing centers and producers in the distribution centers in the 1970s. And now we have the digital platform intermediation in the early 21st century. So they all illustrate that contractual imbalance is not exclusive to consumer law or to contract law, but also exists between professionals. And while such imbalance is in itself, it's part of the competitive game, competition law needs to be equipped to intervene when a dominant firm exploits this imbalance to impose unfair and discriminatory conditions, because it then alters the structure of the market itself. And I think that's why the Court of Justice, in the Super League ruling in December 21, 2023, said that the maintenance or development of undistorted competition in the internal market can only be guaranteed if equal opportunities between undertakings are ensured. And even though this case was not a digital case, it was concerning sports teams and sports championship, I think the solution is aligned with what is happening in digital platforms, and we need to put that for digital platforms. And to do that as well, we need to shape the future of the prohibition by making sure that the enforcement toolkit is better suited. We need to reinforce the sanction, by example, by seeing the fines, why we have a 10% plafond, sorry, I'm losing my English sometimes, 10% maximum, and we actually never put into effect the 10%. It's always more or less of a 3 or 4%. So we need to study the fines. We need as well to see the criminal sanctions, because criminal sanctions is always used for cartels, never for abuse of dominance and monopolization. See why this is. And also the use of structural remedies, I think, needs to be a real sword of Damocles instead of being just a mere illusion, but in case of repeated infringements. And my time is coming to an end, so I'm gonna say, ultimately, the objective now appears to be the restoration of fairness and equity in the market. We have a professor from the University of Nice, Gérard Farjat, the founder of the Droit Économique Economic Law School of Nice. He highlighted the essential duality of competition law between the protection of objective interests, the market with anti-competitive practice, and subjective interests, the competitors, with the protection of unfair commercial practices, or what we have called pratique restrictive de concurrence in France as well. And I think the subjective and objective interests are now intertwined. And the thesis tried to contribute to this perspective by proposing the inclusion of a notion of fairness in the future guidelines or in the standard of abuse of dominance in the US. And I did not, unfortunately, yet have the time to formulate a proper definition of such fairness. And my future work will head in that direction, as this concept is highly controversial because it is described as giving too much power to competition authorities because it's highly subjective. But has it not been the case since the very beginning of competition law anyway, with all standards? In these words, thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to talking with all of you.